Member Carbajal, thanks for calling this hearing today and giving us a chance to review the Coast Guard's FY27 budget request. I want to welcome and thank Admiral Lende and Master Chief Waldron as well for being here today and for the meeting yesterday. Unfortunately, we're meeting today amid yet another lapse of appropriations affecting the Coast Guard. We could pay coasties and provide immediate certainty and stability if we were allowed to vote on the funding bill that already passed the Senate unanimously. Most importantly, though, I want the women and men of the Coast Guard to know they deserve better from their government. For many years, the Coast Guard and senior leaders of the service have called for increased funding so the Coast Guard can perform as the $20 billion agency that it should be. Congress and the administration cannot keep asking more from this service without making these investments. Every day, the women and men of the Coast Guard go out on their missions to save lives, protect our maritime borders, and to keep commerce flowing. The administration's FY27 budget request offers significant promise in some areas, particularly in the operations and support or ONS budget, which increases by 20%. Funding in this range will continue efforts to better prepare the Coast Guard for its core missions and increase the number of service members. This will be necessary as the Coast Guard reconstitutes the stations it downsized during COVID-era recruitment gaps. More funding for the Coast Guard means more lives saved, safer maritime commerce, and more interdicted drugs. Despite the misguided lethal actions taken by the Department of Defense, this Coast Guard yet remains the most effective tool to combat illicit maritime activity. That said, the administration's procurements, construction, and investments, or PC&I budget request fails to meet the needs of the current Coast Guard, let alone one with a growth goal of 15,000 personnel. So I'm eager to discuss the discrepancy between the two major funding pillars and how Congress can fill the gap. The Coast Guard received historic funding last year from the reconciliation bill. Much of that funding was needed to recapitalize assets well past their service life and push the service into the future with the acquisition of state-of-the-art systems. However, this funding and the increase to ONS will be meaningless if we're unable to support the new personnel and assets with adequate home porting piers, workstations, housing, childcare, and healthcare facilities. Supporting the Coast Guard must start with supporting the women and men who serve. This is one of my primary issues with the administration's request. A 15% decrease in the PC&I and funding simply does not do the job. For example, $306 million of the $346 million dedicated to shoreside infrastructure is slated to be spent in Alaska for Arctic security cutter home porting. That leaves $40 million left to attempt to address an over $7 billion backlog. So I wholeheartedly support the funding and forward thinking of the service to tackle these projects because they're needed. However, existing sites like Base Seattle, Training Center Cape May, and the Academy have infrastructure demands that we should address now and prioritize funding there. So I look forward to hearing from both of you today how the Coast Guard views the prioritization of these projects. Furthermore, as the Coast Guard begins to acquire and reinvest in new or previously downgraded and shuttered shoreside facilities, it must prioritize sites that enables it to broaden the coverage of its search and rescue functions. Reconstituting these stations will be a vital benefit as the Coast Guard grows its personnel. Finally, I want to draw attention to the recent changes to the planned home porting of assets at Coast Guard Base Seattle, raised in a news article in an April 11th story and recently confirmed by Coast Guard documents. Initial project plans include upgrades to Seattle waterfront to home port 4 offshore patrol cutters, but have now been scaled back to accommodating, quote, up to 4 major cutters instead. So I do want to hear more details from the Coast Guard about this change and how the Coast Guard plans to prioritize the planning and funding associated with Base Seattle home porting. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Coast Guard's ongoing effort to address sexual assault and sexual harassment in the service. The accountability and transparency review initiated by the former commandant steered the Coast Guard in the right direction, and I'm pleased that you are building on that momentum. The committee will continue to conduct vigorous oversight of the service's actions to implement the AT&R, and we stand ready to help. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields.